A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. The Ring of Sacrifice. The cold stone walls of Blackmore Prison had been weeping moisture for decades, creating an atmosphere thick with despair and the metallic scent of old blood. Leanna Ravencrest pulled her worn cloak tighter around her shoulders as she approached the iron gates, her heart hammering against her ribs with each carefully measured step. The autumn moon hung low in the sky, casting silver shadows across the courtyard where she had spent the last hour waiting for the perfect moment to enact her desperate plan. At 22, Leanna had learned that sometimes salvation required sacrifices others might call foolish. The leather pouch at her belt contained herbs and tinctures from her small apothecary shop, supplies she claimed were needed for wounded prisoners. It was a lie that came easily to her lips, honed by necessity and desperation. The guard who approached matched exactly what she'd hoped to encounter. Middle-aged Garrett, with the soft belly of a man who preferred ale to duty, and eyes that held the calculating gleam of someone always seeking opportunity. According to carefully cultivated tavern gossip, his debts far exceeded his meager salary. "You're out late, healer," Garrett said, his voice rough from years of shouting orders. "What brings you to this cursed place after sunset?" Leanna maintained careful composure, though every instinct screamed to flee this dangerous gamble. "There are men inside who will die before dawn without proper care. Surely even condemned prisoners deserve basic mercy." She had rehearsed these words, knowing the right balance of compassion and authority could open doors that gold alone might not. But gold certainly wouldn't hurt, which was why her fingers trembled as they found the chain around her neck. "The alpha they brought in yesterday," she continued, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've heard his condition is particularly grave. Silver shackles cause wounds that fester without treatment." Garrett's eyes narrowed with interest. She was walking a dangerous line, showing knowledge about the supernatural prisoner brought to Blackmore under heavy guard. The entire village buzzed with rumors about the massive warrior with silver-streaked eyes who had fought 6 men before silver chains and wolfsbane finally subdued him. According to whispered stories, he was Ragnar Ironwolf, alpha of the Stormfang clan, captured during what should have been peaceful territorial negotiations. The official story claimed unprovoked attack, but Leanna recognized political maneuvering. More importantly, she remembered another story about Ragnar Ironwolf, one most villagers had forgotten. 3 years ago, when rogue wolves descended on their settlement like a plague of darkness and claws, Ragnar and his warriors had arrived at the crucial moment to drive them back. He'd stood in the village square afterward, dark hair matted with blood, silver eyes scanning the crowd to ensure every villager was accounted for. Leanna had been 19 then, helping her mother tend the wounded, watching him refuse all hospitality until certain no threat remained. That memory burned now as she faced Garrett's expectant stare. She owed Ragnar Ironwolf a debt that had weighed on her conscience for 3 years. The least she could do was ensure he didn't die alone, forgotten. "What exactly are you proposing?" Garrett asked, voice matching her whisper but gaining suspicious edge. Leanna's hand closed around the ring hanging from her neck. Her mother's ring, the only valuable thing she possessed. It was ancient silver inscribed with protective runes, passed down through generations of healers. Her mother had worn it until her death, and Leanna treasured it as both connection to her lost parent and symbol of her calling. The ring was worth more than Garrett earned in 6 months, and both knew it. 20 minutes alone with the alpha prisoner," she said quietly, pulling the chain free and letting moonlight catch the ring. 20 minutes to treat his wounds properly. In exchange, this is yours." Garrett's eyes fixed on the silver band with intensity that made her stomach churn. She watched him calculate the ring's value against the risk of allowing unauthorized access to such a dangerous prisoner. "Ancient silver," he said finally, reaching to touch the ring with one grimy finger. "Worth a fortune to collectors." "It belonged to my mother, and her mother before her," Leanna replied, surprised by her voice's steadiness despite threatening grief. "I wouldn't offer it lightly." This was true, though she couldn't explain the real reason for her willingness to sacrifice so much. Something deep in her chest had been pulling her toward the prison since learning of Ragnar's capture, a magnetic force she couldn't name or understand. Every rational thought screamed this was madness, throwing away her most precious possession for a man already condemned to die at dawn. but rationality had never governed her most important decisions. 20 minutes, Garrett said finally, pocketing the ring with practiced efficiency. And if anyone asks, you were never here. I know nothing about healers visiting prisoners after hours. Leanna nodded, not trusting her voice as she watched her mother's ring disappear. The loss felt immediate and devastating, as if she'd just severed connection to everything that once made her feel safe. Follow me, Garrett muttered, producing keys from his belt. 20 minutes. Not a second longer. The corridor leading deeper into the prison was narrow and oppressive, lit only by torches casting dancing shadows on stone walls. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with unwashed bodies, despair, and something else that made her skin prickle with awareness. It was a wild scent, speaking of forests and moonlight, and dangers civilized people tried to forget. As they walked, Leanna became increasingly aware of her thundering heartbeat. What was she truly doing here? What could she accomplish with 20 minutes and healing supplies? Even if she eased Ragnar's suffering, he would still die at dawn. She would have traded her mother's ring for nothing more than conscience's satisfaction. But as they approached the heavy door leading to high-security cells, something inside her chest began to warm, responding to an invisible signal she couldn't understand. "This is my limit," Garrett announced, stopping before an iron-banded door. "Your alpha friend is in the last cell on the right. Try not to get killed, healer. I don't fancy explaining to authorities why I let you wander around unguarded." With that encouraging farewell, he unlocked the door and gestured her to enter alone. The chamber beyond was smaller than expected, containing 3 cells separated by thick iron bars. 2 cells were empty, their straw-covered floors evidence of recent occupants who'd likely met sunrise fate. But the 3rd cell, at the far end, was occupied. Even in dim torchlight, Ragnar Ironwolf commanded attention. He sat against the stone wall, silver shackles binding wrists and ankles to chains embedded deep in masonry. His dark hair reached past his shoulders, partially obscuring his face. What struck her most was his carefully maintained beard covering his strong jaw, still neat despite imprisonment. A reminder that even in captivity, he maintained dignity. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, evidence of struggle. The silver shackles had burned angry red welts where they contacted skin, and she could see wounds already showing infection signs. When he raised his head to look at her, Leanna felt the world shift. His eyes were exactly as remembered, silver-gray like storm clouds, but now holding depths of pain and fury that made her breath catch. More than that, something in his gaze seemed to reach across the space between them and wrap around her heart like invisible chains. "You," he said, voice rough from dehydration, filled with emotion she couldn't identify. "I know you." Leanna stepped closer to the bars, hands trembling as she gripped cold iron. "You saved my village 3 years ago. I was there when you drove off the rogues." Ragnar's eyes narrowed slightly as he searched memories. "The healer's daughter. You helped tend the wounded. My mother died last winter," Leanna said quietly, unsure why she felt compelled to share this. "I've taken over her practice." Something shifted in Ragnar's expression, a softening that made him look younger despite pain lines around his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss. She was a good woman. She refused payment for treating my warriors that night. The simple kindness nearly undid her composure. Here was a man facing execution at dawn, chained and wounded and abandoned, offering condolences for a loss he had no obligation to acknowledge. "I've come to help you," she said, holding up her supply bag. "I can't change what happens at sunrise, but I can ensure you don't suffer unnecessarily." Ragnar studied her face intently, silver eyes seeming to catalog every detail. "You bribed the guard. It wasn't a question." Leanna saw no point denying it. "I gave him something valuable, something that belonged to my mother." "Why?" The simple question hung between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to examine. Why had she risked everything to help a man she barely knew? Why had she traded away her most precious possession for 20 minutes in a prison cell? "Because you saved us," she said finally. "Because you didn't have to. But you did. And because—" She trailed off, unable to put words to the inexplicable pull she felt toward him. "Because what?" he prompted gently. Leanna met his eyes, seeing something that made her heart race with fear and anticipation. because it feels like the right thing to do. The only thing. For a moment stretching between heartbeats, they simply looked at each other through iron bars. Then Ragnar smiled. And despite everything, the chains, wounds, certainty of approaching death, it was a smile that transformed his entire face. "Then come closer, little healer," he said softly. "Let's see what magic those talented hands possess." As Leanna fumbled for the key Garrett had given her, she had no idea she was about to cross a threshold that would change both their lives forever. But deep in her chest, something golden and warm was beginning to unfurl. Responding to the presence of the man who would soon become far more than just another patient in need of healing, the key turned in the lock with a soft click that seemed to echo through eternity. Chapter 2. The Claiming Mark. The moment Leanna's fingers made contact with the silver shackles around Ragnar's wrists, the world exploded into sensation that defied explanation. A jolt of pure energy raced up her arms, through her chest, and settled deep in her core like liquid fire that burned without consuming. She gasped, nearly dropping her healing supplies as every nerve in her body awakened with an awareness she had never experienced. Ragnar's reaction was even more profound. His entire body went rigid against the stone wall, his silver-gray eyes widening as they locked onto hers with intensity that made her feel transparent. A low, rumbling sound emerged from deep in his chest. Not quite growl, not quite moan, but something primal that sent shivers cascading down her spine. "What is this?" Leanna breathed, though even as she spoke the words, some ancient part of her already understood. "The mate bond," Ragnar whispered, reverence and desperate longing coloring his voice. "You're my fated mate." The concept should have been foreign to her. She was barely more than human, with only traces of supernatural heritage running through her bloodline. But somehow, recognition bloomed in her chest like sunrise. This connection, this magnetic pull that had been drawing her to him since the moment she learned of his capture, finally made sense within the context of werewolf folklore she'd dismissed as fairy tales. "That's impossible," she said, though her body responded to his presence in ways that had nothing to do with logic. Her skin felt hypersensitive, as though every nerve ending had been awakened from deep sleep. His scent, pine and leather and something uniquely masculine, filled her nostrils and made her head spin with unfamiliar desire. "Feel it," Ragnar urged, his voice rough with emotion. "The bond between us. It's been there all along, dormant but real. That pull you couldn't explain. The reason you risked everything to save a stranger." Leanna's hands trembled as she worked to unlock the first shackle, her movements clumsy from overwhelming sensations coursing through her. The magnetic force that had compelled her to sacrifice her mother's ring. The inexplicable need to save him. It all crystallized now within this supernatural context. "I can feel you," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "In my chest, like warm light that grows stronger when I'm near you." As she lifted the silver shackle away from his wrist, her fingers brushing against angry red welts. That golden warmth spread throughout her body. Without conscious thought, she found herself channeling it toward his injuries, and watched in amazement as infected wounds began healing beneath her touch. "Moon-blessed," Ragnar observed, voice filled with wonder. "Your bloodline carries healing magic passed down through generations so ancient most have forgotten they existed." The first shackle fell away with metallic clang, and immediately the connection between them intensified. Ragnar flexed his freed hand, testing movement, and Leanna couldn't help staring at how his muscles shifted beneath scarred skin. Even injured and imprisoned, he radiated power that called to something deep in her core. "How is this possible?" she asked, as she moved to the second shackle. "I'm not like you. I can't shift, can barely sense supernatural creatures unless they're standing directly in front of me." "The mate bond transcends species and power levels," Ragnar replied, eyes never leaving her face. "It connects souls meant to be together. You're more than you know, little healer. I can sense it. Strength that's been sleeping, waiting for the right catalyst to awaken it." The second shackle joined the first on the stone floor, and suddenly Ragnar's hands were free. Instead of rubbing his wrists or stretching his arms, He reached for her with lightning reflexes, large hands cupping her face with gentleness that contrasted sharply with barely controlled wildness in his silver eyes. "Leanna," he murmured, and hearing her name on his lips sent another wave of heat through her already overloaded system. "My brave, beautiful mate. Do you understand what you've done? What you've sacrificed to save me?" She could feel his breath against her lips, could see flecks of darker gray in his irises, could smell the intoxicating scent that seemed designed to call to every instinct she possessed. "I gave you a chance to heal before." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the reality of his approaching execution. "Before I die at dawn," he completed softly. "But you've given me something far more precious than a few hours without pain. You've shown me that fate hasn't abandoned me entirely." His thumbs traced across her cheekbones, and she found herself leaning into the touch, despite rational thoughts screaming warnings about maintaining distance. This was dangerous territory, not just because he was a condemned prisoner, but because of how her body responded to his proximity. She felt balanced on a cliff's edge, one step away from falling into an abyss from which she might never return. "The guards will return soon," she said, though she made no move to step away from his touch. "Then we don't have much time." His voice carried desperate urgency that made her heart ache. "Leanna, I won't force this on you. The choice must be yours, made freely. But I need you to know that in all my 28 years, I've never felt anything like what I feel when I look at you." The sound of distant footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond, reminding them both that her 20 minutes were nearly spent. In moments, she would have to leave this cell and watch them drag Ragnar to his execution. "If I accept the mate bond," she whispered. "What does that mean?" "It means you would be mine, and I would be yours, for whatever time we have left," he replied without hesitation. "The mating mark would identify you to all supernatural creatures as under my protection, even after my death." Something in his eyes made her breath catch. "There's more, isn't there?" Ragnar's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on her face. "The silver shackles weren't just meant to imprison me, little healer. They were designed to prevent something specific, to keep me too weak to do what every instinct demands when an alpha finds his fated mate." "Which is? To claim her completely," he said quietly. "The mating mark is only the beginning. But it would give you some protection, establish the bond strongly enough that even death might not fully sever it." The sound of jingling keys grew louder in the corridor. Garrett was returning, which meant her time was up. In moments, she would have to watch them lead Ragnar to his execution, unless— "The shackles on your legs," she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "If I remove them, I would be strong enough to escape," he confirmed. "But it would mean running together, leaving your old life behind forever. Are you prepared for that?" Leanna looked into his silver eyes and saw her entire future reflected there. Dangerous, uncertain, but filled with a love that burned brighter than any star. The logical part of her mind cataloged all the reasons this was insane. She barely knew this man beyond stories and a single act of heroism. She would be abandoning her shop, her patients, everything familiar. But the golden warmth in her chest pulsed stronger, and she realized that for the first time in her life, she knew exactly where she belonged. "Yes," she breathed, already reaching for the keys to his ankle shackles. "Yes, I accept the bond." The transformation in Ragnar's face was immediate and breathtaking. Pain and resignation vanished, replaced by something fierce and triumphant, and completely wild. His eyes began to glow with inner light, and she could feel his wolf rising to the surface, responding to her acceptance with primal satisfaction. "My mate," he growled, pulling her closer until she was pressed against the solid warmth of his chest. "My brave, perfect mate." His mouth found the curve of her neck, and she tilted her head instinctively, offering access to the traditional location for a mating mark. She felt the scrape of teeth against sensitive skin, the wet heat of his breath, and then sharp pain lanced through her as his canines pierced her flesh. The pain transformed instantly into pleasure so intense she cried out, would have collapsed if not for his strong arms holding her upright. The sensation was indescribable. Liquid fire flowing through her veins, rewriting every cell to recognize him as her other half. "Mine," he murmured against her throat, voice thick with satisfaction as he sealed the bite with his tongue. "Forever mine." The bond between them snapped into place with such force that Leanna gasped, suddenly able to feel his emotions as clearly as her own. His love, gratitude, and fierce protectiveness flooded her consciousness, along with something else that made her knees weak with desire. As the last ankle shackle fell away, Ragnar rose to his full height, and she could feel power flowing back into his body, the silver's weakening effects finally broken. Through their new bond, she sensed his wolf just beneath the surface, ready to emerge at a moment's notice. "The guard," she whispered, hearing Garrett's approaching footsteps. "Leave him to me," Ragnar replied, and there was something in his voice that spoke of patience finally exhausted and vengeance long overdue. The cell door clanged open as Garrett appeared, his expression shifting from impatience to shock to terror as he took in the scene before him. The fallen shackles, Ragnar standing free and tall, and the unmistakable scent of fresh mating mark in the air. "What have you done?" Garrett whispered, hand moving toward the alarm bell on his belt. "Exactly what was always meant to happen," Ragnar replied calmly, stepping between Leanna and the guard with predatory grace. What followed was swift and efficient. Ragnar's hand closed around Garrett's wrist before the guard could raise the alarm, and with movements too quick for human eyes to follow, he rendered the man unconscious without killing him. "The ring," Leanna said quietly, watching Ragnar search the fallen guard's pockets. He retrieved her mother's ring with reverence that made her heart clench, then stepped behind her to fasten the chain around her neck. His fingers brushed against the fresh mating mark as he did so, sending aftershocks of pleasure through her entire system. "Never again," he murmured against her hair. "Never again will you sacrifice what matters to you for my sake." The sound of distant alarm bells began to echo through the prison, but they were no longer trapped. Through their bond, Leanna could feel Ragnar's wolf rising to the surface, preparing for the escape that would transform them both from prisoners into fugitives. "Ready to run, my brave mate?" he asked, silver eyes beginning to glow with supernatural light. Leanna looked at the unconscious guard, at the fallen shackles, at the man who had become her entire world in the span of 20 minutes. "Together," she said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." As they stepped out of the cell and into an uncertain future, the mate bond pulsed between them like a golden thread, binding them together with magic older than civilization itself. The woman who had walked into Blackmore Prison as a lonely healer was leaving as something far more powerful, the fated mate of an alpha with abilities she was only beginning to understand. The real adventure was just beginning. Chapter 3: Blood and Pursuit. The alarm bells of Blackmore Prison began their bronze dirge, just as Lyanna and Ragnar reached the outer courtyard, their voices cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like the cries of hunting banshees. Leanna pressed herself against the cold stone archway, her heart hammering against her ribs as shouts erupted from the guards' quarters and the sound of running feet echoed off ancient walls. They had discovered the unconscious guard and empty shackles. The mating mark on her neck throbbed in rhythm with her frantic pulse, and through the supernatural bond they now shared, she could feel Ragnar's presence beside her like a steady flame. He was alert, calculating, his predatory instincts fully awakened after days of forced weakness. 20 men, maybe more, he reported grimly, his enhanced hearing detecting what her human senses couldn't yet perceive. Armed with silver weapons and wolfsbane nets. They're organizing quickly. Whoever planned my imprisonment prepared for this possibility. Through the courtyard's shadows, Leanna caught glimpses of movement as armed guards spread out in coordinated search patterns. These weren't the usual prison guards. They moved with military precision, their equipment gleaming with the telltale shine of silver. "There's another way out," she said quickly, her mind racing through childhood memories of exploring the countryside around Blackmore. The old mining tunnels. My mother showed me the entrances when I was young. She used them to move unseen between villages when treating patients. Ragnar's eyes sharpened with interest. "You know these tunnels well enough to navigate them in darkness?" "Well enough," Leanna confirmed, already moving toward what appeared to be an innocuous pile of rubble at the base of the prison's outer wall. The dwarven miners built them centuries ago, before the prison existed. Most entrances were sealed, but some of us never forgot where they were hidden. Her fingers found the concealed lever her mother had shown her years ago, and a section of wall swung inward with the grinding of ancient stone. Beyond lay a tunnel disappearing into impenetrable darkness, but she could feel cool air speaking of deep passages and multiple exits. "Lead the way, clever mate," Ragnar said, his voice carrying both admiration and something deeper, pride in her resourcefulness. "And remind me to thank your mother's spirit for raising such a remarkable daughter." As they plunged into the darkness beneath Blackmoor Prison, Leanna felt a surge of exhilaration that had nothing to do with their narrow escape. For the first time in her adult life, she was exactly where she belonged, beside the man who valued her mind as much as her heart, fleeing toward an uncertain future that nevertheless glowed with possibility. The tunnels were exactly as she remembered, narrow but well constructed, with smooth walls showing the skilled craftsmanship of their builders. Her fingers trailed along stone as she walked, using touch to guide them through passages that hadn't seen light in decades. Behind her, Ragnar moved with the silent grace of his wolf, trusting her completely to lead them to safety. "Tell me about Victor," she said quietly, as they navigated a particularly winding section. Through their bond, she could sense layers of hurt and betrayal surrounding the name, emotions carefully controlled but still raw. "Victor and I grew up together after his parents died in a hunting accident," Ragnar replied, his voice carefully neutral. "My father took him in, raised him alongside me. I trusted him with everything. Pack secrets, strategic plans, even my own doubts and fears." The pain in his words made her chest tight with sympathy. "What changed between you?" "Power," Ragnar said with bitter simplicity. "When my father died 2 years ago and I became Alpha, Victor expected to be named my second. When I chose someone else based on merit rather than family connection, something in him turned cold. I thought he had accepted my decision, but apparently he'd been planning revenge ever since." They paused at a junction where 3 tunnels branched off in different directions. Leanna closed her eyes, trying to remember which path her mother had taken during their childhood explorations. "So he made contact with enemy clans and offered to deliver you to them?" she asked, choosing the leftmost tunnel based on the feel of air movement. "More than that," Ragnar replied grimly. "He fed them intelligence about our patrol routes, our defenses, even the locations of our sacred sites. The meeting where I was captured was supposed to be a negotiation for territorial boundaries, but it was a trap from the beginning. The implications made her stomach churn. How many others were hurt because of his betrayal? 3 of my warriors died in that ambush." Ragnar's voice dropped to a growl that made her primitive hindbrain shiver with recognition. Good men with families, cut down because they trusted their alpha to keep them safe. Leanna reached out without thinking, her hand finding his in the darkness and squeezing gently. The moment their skin made contact, that golden warmth began flowing between them again, and she felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. "Their deaths aren't your fault," she said firmly. "Victor's choices are his own responsibility, not yours." "Are they?" Ragnar's hand tightened around hers. "If I had been a better judge of character, if I had seen the signs of his resentment, then you would be prescient, not just an alpha." Leanna interrupted. "You can't protect people from every possible threat, Ragnar. Sometimes terrible things happen despite our best efforts." They walked in companionable silence for several minutes, their footsteps echoing softly in the ancient passageway. But gradually, Leanna became aware of another sound. The distant rumble of voices, growing steadily closer. "They've found the entrance," Ragnar confirmed, his enhanced hearing detecting the pursuit long before it would be audible to her. "Multiple groups, moving through different tunnel systems. Victor must have known about these passages. Of course he did," Leanna realized with growing dread. "My mother wasn't the only healer who used these tunnels. If Victor has been planning this for 2 years, he would have researched every possible escape route," Ragnar finished grimly. "We're not just being pursued, we're being herded." The sound of approaching voices grew louder, echoing from multiple directions now. Through their bond, Leanna could feel Ragnar's wolf pressing closer to the surface, responding to the threat with predatory alertness. The main exit is still half a mile ahead, she said, her heart sinking as she realized the implications. They'll catch us before we reach it. Ragnar stopped walking, his hand tightening protectively around hers. Then we don't try to outrun them. We make our stand here, where the narrow passages work in our favor. Us? Leanna questioned, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. You're my mate now, he replied with quiet conviction. That means we face everything together. But when I tell you to run, you run. Promise me. Leanna looked at him in the darkness, feeling through their bond his absolute determination to protect her, even at the cost of his own life. I promise, she lied, knowing she would never abandon him regardless of how desperate their situation became. The first torchlight appeared at the far end of the tunnel, followed by the sound of coordinated footsteps. But instead of the chaotic pursuit she expected, the approaching forces moved with military discipline that spoke of careful planning and superior numbers. My dear cousin, a cultured voice called out, echoing off the stone walls with aristocratic confidence. Surely there's no need for this continued unpleasantness. Come out, and let's discuss your situation like civilized wolves. Ragnar's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, his canines already lengthening in preparation for what was to come. Victor, he growled, the name carrying years of hurt and betrayal. I should have known he wouldn't risk his own neck by leading the hunt personally, Leanna whispered. But even as she spoke, she could smell something else in the air. Expensive cologne mixed with the scent of superiority, and barely contained violence. Oh, but I am here, dear cousin. Victor's voice came again, closer now, along with some friends who were very interested to meet the legendary Ragnar Ironwolf. The Blood Moon clan sends their regards, as do several human mercenaries who specialize in hunting supernatural fugitives. The torchlight grew brighter, and Leanna could see shadows moving with purpose through the tunnel system. They were surrounded, trapped in a web that had been years in the making. What do you want, Victor? Ragnar called out, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha despite their precarious position. What I've always wanted, came the reply, now close enough that individual footsteps could be distinguished. What should have been mine from the beginning? The pack, the territory, and now, your newly acquired mate. The casual way Victor mentioned her made Leanna's skin crawl with revulsion. Through the bond, she felt Ragnar's fury spike to dangerous levels, his control over his wolf form beginning to strain under the pressure of protective rage. She bears my mark, Ragnar said, his voice dropping to the deadly calm that preceded explosions of violence. The claiming has been completed. Has it? Victor's laugh echoed off the stone walls with cruel amusement. A hasty bite in a prison cell hardly constitutes a proper claiming, cousin, especially when the mate in question possesses abilities neither of you fully understands yet. The torchlight was close enough now that Leanna could make out individual figures, men in dark clothing carrying silver weapons, their movements coordinated with military precision. At their head walked a figure she recognized from Ragnar's descriptions. Tall, aristocratic, with features similar enough to her mate's to mark them as family, but carrying an aura of cold calculation that made her instinctively recoil. Victor stepped into the intersection where they waited, flanked by armed men whose scents spoke of different clans and species. His smile was perfectly practiced, the expression of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm or force. Leanna, he said, inclining his head in a mockery of polite greeting. Such a pleasure to finally meet you properly. Your reputation as a healer precedes you, though I suspect your true value lies in abilities you haven't even discovered yet. What do you want? She asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. What any sensible alpha wants, Victor replied easily. A mate worthy of strengthening the bloodline, territory to expand my influence, and the elimination of threats to the natural order. The casual way he discussed her as property made Ragnar's growl fill the tunnel, a sound of pure animalistic fury that made the armed men shift nervously. But Victor seemed unperturbed, his attention focused entirely on Leanna with an intensity that made her feel like prey being evaluated by a predator. Here's what's going to happen, Victor continued conversationally. You're going to come with me willingly, and in exchange, I'll ensure Ragnar's death is quick and relatively painless. Refuse, and I'll let my associates demonstrate why they're considered the best supernatural hunters in the region. Through their bond, Lyanna felt Ragnar's desperate protest, his willingness to die rather than see her suffer. The choice was impossible: save the man she loved by condemning herself to a lifetime with his treacherous cousin, or watch Victor torture him while she remained helpless. But as she looked into Victor's cold blue eyes, Lyanna realized something important. He needed her alive and relatively unharmed, which meant she had leverage he didn't expect her to recognize. "If I agree," she said slowly, "you swear on your honor as an alpha that Ragnar won't be harmed." "You have my word," Victor replied solemnly, though something in his expression suggested his definition of honor might not match hers. Lyanna felt Ragnar's shock through their bond as she stepped forward, lifting her chin with all the dignity she could muster. But instead of the submission Victor expected, she smiled, an expression cold enough to make several of his mercenaries take involuntary steps backward. "Then you should know," she said quietly, "that you've made a critical error in your planning." Victor's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. "What do you mean?" Through their bond, Lyanna sent Ragnar a pulse of absolute trust and determination. "You assumed the mate of an alpha would be weak. You forgot that the moon goddess never bonds strength to weakness, only to its equal." The golden warmth in her chest suddenly blazed like a star going nova, and the healing abilities she'd always taken for granted transformed into something far more potent. The mating mark on her neck began to glow with soft silver light, and she watched Victor's eyes widen with the first stirrings of genuine fear. "Now, my love," she whispered, and felt Ragnar's wolf surge to the surface with predatory joy. What followed would become legend among the surviving mercenaries. The night a healer discovered she was so much more, and an alpha reclaimed both his freedom and his destiny in a tunnel deep beneath Blackmoor Prison. Chapter 4. Sanctuary and Truth. The abandoned cottage sat nestled in a grove of ancient oak trees, its stone walls weathered by decades of neglect, but still solid enough to provide shelter from the storm clouds gathering overhead. Lyanna pushed open the heavy wooden door, her muscles aching from the harrowing journey through forest paths that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. The air inside was musty with disuse, but dry, and she could see the outline of a stone hearth that promised warmth once she managed to coax fire from the scattered kindling. "This will serve our needs," Ragnar said quietly, his voice still carrying the rough edge of someone who had spent hours balancing between human and wolf form during their desperate flight. He had shifted back to human shape only when they reached the cottage, and Lyanna was trying very hard not to think about how his torn prison clothes revealed the powerful physique of a man built for both protection and conquest. She busied herself with building a fire, grateful for the familiar task that gave her hands something to do, while her mind processed everything that had transpired since walking into Blackmoor Prison. The mating mark on her neck pulsed with constant awareness of his presence, and every time he moved behind her, arranging their meager supplies, checking the cottage's defenses, she felt echoes of sensation that made her breath catch. Through their bond, she could sense the layers of his thoughts: relief at their escape, concern for her well-being, and underneath it all, a growing intensity that spoke of needs barely held in check. The mate bond was more than just emotional connection. It was a pull toward physical completion that grew stronger with each passing hour. "Tell me about the abilities I displayed in the tunnels," she said, needing to focus on practical matters rather than the way firelight played across his scarred chest. That power, the way I could suddenly do things I'd never imagined possible. Ragnar settled on the floor beside her, close enough that she could feel warmth radiating from his body, but not quite touching. Moon-blessed bloodlines carry magic that's been dormant in most families for generations. Your mother likely had similar abilities but chose to keep them hidden for your protection. The fire caught with satisfying crackle, and Lyanna sat back on her heels to study his profile in the dancing light. His expression was carefully controlled, but through their bond, she could sense the depth of knowledge he possessed about supernatural heritage. "Why would she hide it?" she asked softly. "Because power draws attention," Ragnar replied grimly, "and not all of that attention is benevolent. There are those who would use moon-blessed abilities for their own purposes, regardless of the cost to the individual." Lyanna pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as she absorbed this information. Like Victor? Victor is just the beginning, Ragnar said with bitter honesty. If word spreads about what you can do, about what our bond represents, there will be others. Alphas who see you as a prize to be won, councils who view you as a resource to be controlled, enemies who consider you a threat to be eliminated. The implications made her stomach churn, but also sparked something defiant in her chest. Let them come, she said quietly. I'm tired of hiding from what I am. Ragnar turned to look at her fully, and she could see admiration mixing with concern in his silver eyes. My brave mate, he murmured. But bravery without wisdom is just another form of recklessness. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching flames dance and listening to wind picking up outside the cottage. But gradually, Lyanna became aware of other sensations. The way Ragnar's thumb traced small circles on her palm when their hands accidentally touched, the heat building between them despite the evening's coolness, the pull of the mating bond that seemed to grow stronger with each shared breath. There's something else we need to discuss, she said finally, though her voice came out huskier than intended. Victor mentioned that our bond wasn't complete, that a hasty bite in a prison cell doesn't constitute proper claiming. Ragnar's eyes darkened, and she could feel his desire spike through their connection like liquid fire. The mating mark establishes the bond and provides some protection, he said carefully. But werewolf mating customs involve additional ceremonies and physical bonding that strengthens the connection beyond what can be challenged by outside forces. Physical bonding, she repeated, her cheeks warming as understanding dawned. You're talking about consummation. Among other things, he agreed. The complete claiming involves trust, acceptance, and the joining of not just bodies, but souls. It's not something to be undertaken lightly, especially when both parties are still learning about each other. Lyanna studied his face in the firelight, seeing the careful control he maintained despite the hunger she could sense through their bond. And if we don't complete the claiming, what then? Then Victor's claim about being able to challenge our bond has some validity, Ragnar admitted reluctantly. Ancient laws do allow for such challenges under specific circumstances, especially if the female has not fully accepted her mate. The cottage suddenly felt too small, the air too thick with unspoken possibilities. Lyanna stood abruptly, moving to the small window that overlooked the forest. She could see her reflection in the glass, face flushed, eyes bright with desire and uncertainty in equal measure. You're asking me to commit to something permanent, she said quietly, to bind myself to a man I've known for less than a day, no matter how strongly this bond pulls at me. I'm not asking you to do anything, Ragnar replied, and she could hear him moving closer behind her. The choice has to be yours, made freely without coercion. I won't be like Victor, using circumstances to force what should be given willingly. She turned to face him, and the raw honesty in his silver eyes made her knees weak with want and fear combined. And if I need time, if I'm not ready for such complete commitment, then we take that time, he said without hesitation. I've waited 28 years to find my mate. I can wait longer for her to be certain of her choice. The declaration should have reassured her, but instead, it only highlighted the impossible situation they faced. If she delayed, Victor could use ancient laws to challenge their bond. If she agreed immediately, she would be binding herself to someone she barely knew, no matter how strong the supernatural connection between them. Show me, she said suddenly, the words escaping before her rational mind could stop them. Ragnar went very still. Show you what? Everything, she clarified, though her voice trembled with nervousness. If I'm going to make this choice, I need to understand what I'm choosing. Show me your wolf. Show me what it means to be mated to an alpha. Show me the truth of what we could become together. For a long moment, he simply stared at her. Then, slowly, he began to remove the tattered remains of his prison clothes. Lyanna's breath caught as more of his skin was revealed, not just because of his undeniable masculine beauty, but because of the scars that mapped his body like a history of battles fought and survived. I'm not just a man who can become a wolf, he warned quietly. I'm a predator, Lyanna. A creature designed by nature to hunt, kill, and dominate. The beast inside me recognizes you as mine, with an intensity that sometimes frightens even me." She nodded, though her heart was racing with equal parts terror and anticipation. "Show me everything." The transformation began with his eyes, the silver irises beginning to glow with inner fire that spoke of wildness barely contained. Then his muscles started to ripple and expand, his human form blurring as supernatural forces reshaped bone and sinew with fluid grace. She watched in fascination, as his carefully groomed beard remained perfectly maintained, even as the rest of his features elongated, as though his wolf form respected the dignity he maintained, even in his most primal state. Within moments, the man was gone, replaced by a creature that stole her breath with its magnificence. His wolf form was even larger than she had glimpsed during their escape, a massive beast with midnight black fur that seemed to absorb the firelight, but it was his eyes that held her captive. Still recognizably Ragnar's, but now burning with the ancient wisdom of apex predators. The wolf approached her slowly, giving her time to flee if she chose. When he was close enough to touch, he lowered his massive head and waited, offering her the choice of contact without pressure or demand. With trembling fingers, Lyanna reached out and buried her hands in his thick fur. The wolf made a soft sound, not quite whine, not quite purr, and leaned into her touch. Through their bond, she could feel his emotions: protective love, desperate hope, and underneath it all, the wild hunger of a predator who had found his perfect match. "You're magnificent," she whispered, and the wolf's tail moved in what might have been pleased acknowledgement. As she continued to touch him, stroking the powerful muscles beneath his fur, Lyanna felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear, but recognition. This dangerous, beautiful creature was hers, just as surely as she was his. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, it filled her with a sense of completion she had never experienced. "I accept you," she said quietly, meeting those glowing silver eyes. "All of you. The man and the wolf, the protector and the predator. If you'll have me." The wolf stilled beneath her hands, and she felt his overwhelming joy through their bond like sunrise warming her from within. Gradually, he began to shift back to human form, the transformation as beautiful and fluid as before. When Ragnar stood before her again, naked and magnificent, and utterly hers, he cupped her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. "My mate," he murmured, and the words carried the weight of vows spoken and destinies accepted. "My brave, perfect mate. Are you ready to complete this bond between us?" Lyanna looked into his eyes and saw her future reflected there, dangerous, uncertain, but filled with a love that would burn brighter than any star. The cottage around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. "I'm ready," she whispered, and stepped forward to claim the destiny that had been calling to her since the moment she first saw him chained in that prison cell. As Ragnar's arms closed around her, and his mouth found hers in a kiss that tasted of promise and forever, the mate bond between them blazed like molten gold, preparing to forge them into something stronger than either could be alone. The true claiming was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Price of Betrayal. 3 days of paradise had passed in the abandoned cottage. 3 days where the world narrowed to nothing beyond stone walls that sheltered them from everything except their growing connection. Lyanna had never imagined such happiness was possible. Waking in Ragnar's arms each morning, sharing quiet conversations by the fire, learning the rhythms of a love that felt both ancient and startlingly new. The mating bond between them had settled into something warm and steady, a constant golden thread that made her feel complete in ways she had never known she was lacking. But paradise, as every fairy tale warned, was never meant to last forever. The sound that woke her wasn't loud, just the soft scrape of a boot on stone somewhere beyond their sanctuary. But Ragnar went rigid beside her, his enhanced senses detecting threats long before her human ears could perceive them. Through their completed bond, she felt his instant transformation from sleepy contentment to lethal alertness. "How many?" she whispered, already reaching for the clothes they had learned to keep within easy reach, a precaution that had become habit. "Too many to count," Ragnar replied grimly, sliding from their makeshift bed with predatory grace. At least 30, surrounding the cottage in coordinated positions. They've been moving into place for hours while we slept. Leanna's blood chilled as the implications hit her. Victor, his scent is everywhere, Ragnar confirmed, his voice carrying controlled fury that spoke of patience finally exhausted, along with mercenaries, Blood Moon Clan warriors, and something else. Magic that doesn't belong to our kind. As if summoned by their conversation, a cultured voice called out from the forest beyond their walls. It carried easily through the morning air, with aristocratic confidence, and just enough mockery to make Leanna's skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. "Cousin dear," Victor's voice drifted through the stone walls. "Surely there's no need for this continued unpleasantness. Come out, and let's discuss your situation like civilized wolves." Ragnar's lips pulled back in a silent snarl that was more wolf than human. Victor always did prefer pretty words and overwhelming numbers to honest confrontation. "Who else is he working with?" Leanna asked, struggling into her dress while trying to keep her movements silent. Through their bond, she could feel Ragnar's wolf pressing against the surface, responding to the threat with barely contained violence. The scent signatures suggest Blood Moon Clan enforcers, human mercenaries who specialize in hunting supernatural creatures, and he paused, nostrils flaring as he identified the strange magical signatures. A blood witch. Someone old and powerful enough to mask supernatural bonds. The implications made her stomach churn. Blood witches were creatures of nightmare and forbidden legend, practitioners of magic so corrupt it violated the natural order itself. If Victor had allied himself with such beings, their situation was far worse than she had imagined. Through the cottage's single window, Leanna caught glimpses of movement among the trees. Armed figures in dark clothing, carrying weapons that gleamed with silver, their positions coordinated with military precision. These weren't the chaotic rogues who had once threatened her village. This was an army prepared for war. "There has to be a way out," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The mining tunnels, or perhaps all blocked," Ragnar said quietly, and she could feel his grim resignation through their bond. "Victor knows this terrain as well as I do. He would never have approached without cutting off every possible escape route." The voice came again, closer now, as if Victor was walking casually toward their door despite the danger he knew Ragnar represented. "I know you can hear me, dear cousin, and I know you have the lovely Leanna with you. Such a remarkable woman. Did you know that completing your mate bond has awakened abilities even she doesn't fully understand yet?" Leanna went cold, her hand instinctively moving to the fully healed mating mark on her neck. Through their connection, she could sense new depths to her powers, abilities that had been sleeping until the bond's completion brought them to the surface. If Victor knew about these changes, "He's been watching us," she whispered, horror creeping into her voice. "He knows we completed the bond." Ragnar's expression darkened with murderous intent. "Victor," he called out, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha, despite their precarious position. "If you have something to say it to my face instead of hiding behind your hired killers." "Gladly," Victor replied, and Leanna heard the soft sound of the cottage door being pushed open. The man who entered was everything she had expected, and nothing she had prepared for. He looked enough like Ragnar to mark them as family. The same height and aristocratic bone structure, but where Ragnar's presence radiated controlled strength tempered by honor, Victor's carried cold, calculating intelligence that made her feel like prey being evaluated by a predator. His clothes were immaculate despite the early hour and forest setting. His smile the practiced expression of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm or violence. "Leanna," he said, inclining his head in a mockery of polite greeting. "Such a pleasure to finally meet you properly. I must say, completing the mate bond has done wonders for your potential. What do you want, Victor?" Ragnar stepped protectively in front of her, every line of his body radiating the promise of violence. "What I've always wanted," Victor replied with casual ease. "What should have been mine from the beginning. The pack, the territory, and now, your extraordinarily gifted mate." The way he spoke about her as property made Leanna's stomach churn, but also sparked something defiant in her chest. "I belong to no one but myself," she said, proud that her voice remained steady despite her fear. Victor's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed just slightly too sharp. But that's where recent developments have changed things considerably. You see, my dear, completing the mate bond with dear Ragnar has awakened bloodline abilities that make you far more valuable than either of you realized. Through their bond, she felt Ragnar's sudden surge of protective rage, but also something else. Fear. Not for himself, but for her, and what Victor's words implied. The moon-blessed bloodline carries power that's been dormant in most families for generations, Victor continued conversationally. But when awakened by the bond with a sufficiently powerful alpha, those abilities can reshape the very nature of supernatural politics. Healing becomes destruction, protection becomes conquest, wisdom becomes the power to command the very forces of nature. You're insane, Lyanna whispered, though even as she spoke the words, she could feel truth in them. The powers she had displayed during their escape, the way she could sense magical signatures and influence supernatural forces, it was all connected to the completed bond. Am I? Victor pulled a small vial from his coat, and Lyanna could see dark liquid swirling inside with its own malevolent life. This contains a sample of your mother's blood, taken the night I killed her. Blood that still carries echoes of the poison I used to ensure she couldn't share family secrets with her daughter. The casual admission hit Lyanna like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. You murdered her? I eliminated a threat to the natural order, Victor corrected with chilling matter-of-factness. Your mother understood what you could become with the right catalyst. She spent years suppressing your abilities, hiding your true nature from those who would use you. But death has a way of making such precautions irrelevant. Ragnar's growl filled the cottage, a sound of pure animalistic fury that made the windows rattle. You murdering bastard! Careful, cousin, Victor interrupted, raising one hand in a gesture that brought armed figures into view at every window and doorway. Remember, you're outnumbered 30-1, and my associates specialize in hunting creatures exactly like you. As if to demonstrate his point, several mercenaries stepped into view, their weapons trained on Ragnar with professional precision. Lyanna could see silver bullets in their guns, wolfsbane-laced nets ready to deploy, all designed to bring down even the most powerful alpha. Here's what's going to happen, Victor continued with conversational calm. Lyanna is going to come with me willingly, and in exchange, I'll ensure Ragnar's death is quick and relatively painless. Refuse, and I'll let my associates demonstrate why they're considered the finest supernatural hunters gold can buy. Every instinct in Lyanna's body screamed against the proposal, but through their bond she could feel Ragnar's desperation, his willingness to die rather than see her suffer. The choice seemed impossible. Save the man she loved by condemning herself to Victor's plans, or watch him be tortured to death while she remained helpless. If I agree, she said slowly, you swear you won't harm him? You have my word as an alpha. Victor replied solemnly, though something in his eyes suggested his definition of honor might not match hers, but instead of the immediate compliance Victor expected, Lyanna smiled, an expression cold enough to make several mercenaries shift nervously. Then you should know, she said quietly, that you've made several critical errors in your planning. Victor's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. What do you mean? Through their bond, Lyanna sent Ragnar a pulse of absolute trust and love, along with something else, a plan born of desperation and the growing awareness of her own power. You assumed that completing the mate bond made me more valuable. You never considered that it might also make me more dangerous. The golden warmth in her chest suddenly blazed like a star being born, and the abilities Victor was so eager to exploit transformed into something far more potent than healing magic. The mating mark on her neck began to glow with silver light, and she watched Victor's eyes widen with the first stirrings of genuine fear. You see, she continued, feeling power flowing through their bond from Ragnar to amplify her own abilities. The moon-blessed don't just heal. When properly motivated, we can do so much more. The cottage around them began to tremble as forces older than civilization itself responded to her call, and Lyanna realized that the real battle was just beginning. Victor had wanted to claim a weapon. He was about to discover he had awakened a force of nature instead. Chapter 6. Bonds of iron. The great hall of Victor's stronghold was everything Leanna had expected from a man who valued power above all else. Imposing stone walls lined with banners depicting conquest. A massive hearth designed more for intimidation than warmth, and everywhere the oppressive scent of dominance barely contained. She sat in the ornate chair Victor had indicated, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their trembling, while he paced before her with the satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. But Victor had made a critical miscalculation. The woman he had captured was no longer the uncertain healer who had walked into Blackmore prison. The completed mate bond had awakened abilities that pulsed through her veins like liquid starlight, and through her connection with Ragnar, she could feel his presence even through the stone walls of his prison far below. "You really are quite remarkable," Victor said, pausing to study her with those cold blue eyes that shared Ragnar's coloring, but none of his warmth. "I can practically see the power radiating from you now that the bond is complete. The moon-blessed bloodline shows in everything from your posture to the way magic responds to your presence. What do you truly want from me?" Leanna asked, pleased that her voice carried steady authority despite the terror coiling in her stomach. "Want?" Victor laughed, the sound echoing off stone walls with unpleasant resonance. "My dear, what I want is to harness that extraordinary power flowing through you. The moon-blessed abilities you've awakened could reshape the entire supernatural hierarchy, but only in the hands of someone with the wisdom and strength to wield them properly." He moved closer, and Leanna fought every instinct that screamed at her to flee. Through the mate bond, she could sense Ragnar's fury and desperation, but also something else. He was planning, preparing, drawing on resources Victor couldn't detect. "The bond between Ragnar and myself is complete," she said, meeting Victor's gaze with defiance. "You can't simply break what the moon goddess herself has forged." "Can't I?" Victor's smile was sharp as a blade. "Perhaps not through conventional means, but I've spent considerable time and resources preparing for exactly this situation. 3 days to consult with experts in supernatural bonds, and the methods to redirect them." As if summoned by his words, the hall's side door opened to admit a figure that made Leanna's blood freeze. The woman who entered was ancient beyond measure, her skin like parchment stretched over sharp bones, her eyes milky white with cataracts that somehow conveyed malevolent intelligence. The aura of wrongness surrounding her, magic that felt like corruption given form, told Leanna exactly what she faced. "A blood witch," she whispered, her mother's warnings about such creatures echoing through her mind. "Morgana Darkbane," Victor said by way of introduction. "Meet the lovely Leanna. Morgana, this is our moon-blessed prize." The witch approached with shuffling steps that covered ground with unnatural speed. When she reached Leanna's chair, she extended one gnarled finger toward the mating mark on her neck, but stopped just short of contact as silver light began emanating from Leanna's skin. "Interesting," Morgana croaked, her voice like grinding stone. "The bond is indeed complete, but that presents opportunities rather than obstacles. A fully awakened moon-blessed is far more valuable than a dormant one. Can you transfer the bond?" Victor asked, his tone carrying casual interest that made Leanna's stomach churn. "Transfer, redirect, amplify, all within my capabilities," the witch replied with disturbing enthusiasm. "But such power comes with proportional risk. The moon-blessed are not passive vessels to be manipulated at will. Their magic has ways of defending itself." Through her bond with Ragnar, Leanna felt a pulse of fierce approval and something else. Instructions, wordless but clear. He was telling her to trust in her abilities, to remember that the magic flowing through her was hers to command. "What are the risks?" Victor pressed, though his eyes never left Leanna's face. "If the ritual fails," Morgana said with chilling matter-of-factness, "the backlash could destroy everyone in this hall. Moon-blessed magic, when cornered, becomes volatile, but successfully completed, you would possess not only her abilities, but the amplification that comes from bonding with power already awakened." The casual discussion of magical violation made Leanna's jaw clench, but it also sparked something deeper. the same defiant flame that had driven her to save a condemned prisoner with nothing but determination and her mother's ring. If Victor thought she would submit meekly to his schemes, he had severely underestimated what his cousin's mate had become. "How long do I have?" she asked quietly, already beginning to gather the power flowing through her like golden threads. "Until moonrise," Victor replied, checking the high windows where afternoon light was already slanting toward evening. "Morgana's magic works best under the full moon, and tonight's celestial alignment is particularly favorable. Hours." She had hours before they attempted to violate the most sacred bond known to their kind. Through her connection with Ragnar, she could feel his growing desperation, his frantic efforts to escape whatever prison held him. "May I have time alone to prepare myself?" she asked, injecting just enough resignation into her voice to make Victor believe she was beginning to accept the inevitable. "Of course," Victor replied magnanimously. "I want you to understand that this is ultimately for the greater good. Your abilities combined with my strategic vision could bring peace and order to territories that have known only chaos." The twisted logic in his words made Lyanna want to scream, but she nodded gracefully and allowed herself to be escorted to a guest chamber that was clearly designed as a comfortable prison. The door locked from the outside, the windows were barred, and she could sense armed guards in the corridor beyond. But as she settled into the chair beside the window, Lyanna felt something she hadn't expected. Her mother's spirit seeming to whisper encouragement, reminding her of lessons half forgotten about the true nature of their bloodline. Closing her eyes, Lyanna reached deep into memories of childhood, searching for fragments of knowledge her mother had shared about moon-blessed heritage. Not just healing, but other gifts that came with their ancient lineage. The ability to sense supernatural creatures across vast distances, to influence magical energies, and most importantly, to send her consciousness along the bonds that connected her to those she loved, placing her hand over her heart where the mate bond pulsed like a second heartbeat. Lyanna began focusing all her energy on that golden connection. The process was exhausting, requiring her to pour her life force into the bond until she felt hollow and dizzy. But gradually, the connection strengthened and solidified, becoming less like a thread and more like a bridge spanning the distance between their souls. Through that bridge, she sent everything. Not just words, but complete understanding of where she was, what Victor planned, the presence of the Blood Witch, and the timing of the ritual. Most importantly, she shared her own plan, desperate and dangerous as it was. The moon-blessed bloodline carried power that could be used for healing, yes, but also for other purposes if the wielder was prepared to pay the price. If Victor wanted to harness her abilities through blood magic, perhaps she could turn that same magic against him and his witch. But she would need Ragnar's strength amplifying her own, and she would need perfect timing. The connection stabilized just as footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Through the mate bond, she felt Ragnar's fierce approval of her plan, along with his promise that he would be ready when the moment came. "Little healer," came Victor's voice through the door. "It's time for you to fulfill your true destiny." Lyanna stood slowly, smoothing her dress and checking that the small vial of wolfsbane and silver extract she had managed to prepare was secure in her sleeve. It wasn't enough to kill an alpha outright, but it would certainly weaken him at the crucial moment. "I'm ready," she called back, surprised by the steel in her own voice. As the door opened, and Victor's guards moved to escort her back to the great hall, Lyanna felt the mate bond pulse with love and determination. Whatever happened next, she would face it as Ragnar's equal. Not as a prize to be won, but as a force of nature finally awakened to her true power. The Blood Witch might think she understood moon-blessed magic, but she was about to discover that some bonds were forged by forces far older and stronger than any corruption she could wield. Chapter 7. Blood and Fire. The great hall had been transformed into something from the darkest of nightmares. Black candles flickered along the stone walls, their flames casting writhing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. The air was thick with incense that burned her throat and made her eyes water. But underneath it, Lyanna could detect the metallic scent of fresh blood. At the center of the hall, Morgana had drawn an intricate circle using what looked suspiciously like dried blood mixed with powdered silver, the patterns pulsing with their own sickly light. Victor stood beside the Blood Witch, resplendent in ceremonial robes that made him look like some twisted parody of a holy man. His eyes gleamed with anticipation as he watched Leanna being led to the circle's edge, and she could smell his arousal mixed with triumph, a combination that made her stomach churn with revulsion. "Beautiful," he murmured as she was positioned at the northern point of the circle. "You have no idea how long I've dreamed of this moment, sweet Leanna. How many nights I've imagined harnessing the power that flows through your veins." "And you need blood magic to access it," Leanna replied quietly, proud that her voice carried no trace of the terror clawing at her insides. "How fitting for someone who murdered my mother." Victor's expression darkened at her tone, but before he could respond, Morgana cackled with delight. "Oh, she has spirit, this one. It will make binding her power all the more satisfying." The witch moved to the center of the circle, carrying a ceremonial chalice that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Now then, child, let's begin with something simple. Your blood, freely given, will anchor the ritual." When Leanna hesitated, two of Victor's guards stepped forward, their hands moving to silver daggers at their belts. The threat was clear: cooperate, or they would take her blood by force. Through the mate bond, she could feel Ragnar's presence growing stronger, closer. But he wasn't here yet. She needed to buy more time. "What exactly does this ritual accomplish?" she asked, extending her hand with feigned reluctance. "Nothing too complex," Morgana replied, producing a silver blade that gleamed with unnatural sharpness. "Your blood, mixed with his, while I weave the proper enchantments. The magic will transfer your mate bond from the absent alpha to the one who stands before you, along with all the power that bond has awakened." The blade bit into Leanna's palm with surgical precision, sending drops of her blood into the dark chalice. The moment her blood made contact with whatever was already inside, the liquid began to smoke and writhe like something alive. But instead of the corruption she expected, she felt her own power responding to the mixture. Through their bond, she sensed Ragnar's location, directly below them, in the stronghold's deepest dungeons, but no longer imprisoned. He was moving, fighting, drawing closer with each passing moment. "Excellent," Victor said, moving to add his own blood to the mixture. The moon-blessed bloodline is even more potent than the ancient text suggested. As Victor's blood joined hers, Leanna felt something she hadn't expected. A brief moment of connection, similar to but utterly wrong compared to the mate bond she shared with Ragnar. Through that twisted link, she caught a glimpse of Victor's true nature: the casual cruelty, the complete lack of empathy, the cold calculation that drove every action. But she also sensed something else, a fundamental weakness in his magical defenses. Victor's power as an alpha came from domination and fear, rather than the earned loyalty that strengthened Ragnar. It made him predictable, brittle in ways he didn't recognize. "Now comes the delicate part," Morgana announced, beginning to chant in a language that seemed to crawl along Leanna's skin like insects. "Drink, child, and let the magic remake your very essence." The chalice was pressed to Leanna's lips, and she could smell the corruption within. Not just the blood magic, but something designed to weaken her will and make the magical transformation easier. If she drank this, Victor believed she would become exactly what he wanted: a compliant source of power with no memory of the man she truly loved. But as the rim of the chalice touched her lips, Leanna made her move. Instead of drinking, she bit down hard on her own tongue, filling her mouth with blood charged with her moon-blessed abilities. Then, channeling every ounce of power flowing through her, she made that blood burn with purifying energy. When Morgana forced the chalice forward, expecting her to swallow the corrupted mixture, Leanna spat her charged blood directly into the witch's face. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Morgana shrieked as the purified blood ate through her flesh like acid, her ancient features dissolving into writhing corruption. The dark magic that had sustained her for centuries turned against itself, and within moments, the powerful blood witch was nothing more than ash and screaming wind. The ritual circle exploded with backlash energy, silver flames racing along the blood-drawn patterns and setting the ceremonial banners ablaze. Victor was thrown backward by the magical shockwave, his robes catching fire as he crashed into the stone wall behind him. But Lyanna's desperate gamble had cost her. Using so much of her life force at once left her drained and weak, her knees buckling as darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. Through the mate bond, she could feel Ragnar's presence like a blazing star, but he still seemed impossibly far away. "You little bitch!" Victor snarled, staggering to his feet and ripping away his burning robes to reveal the muscled torso beneath. His eyes had shifted to the golden glow of his wolf, and she could see his human restraint cracking under the pressure of rage and thwarted desire. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've cost me? I've stopped you from violating the most sacred bond known to our kind," Lyanna managed, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Temporarily," Victor corrected, advancing on her with predatory intent. "Blood magic was just one option. There are other methods of claiming what I want, older and far more brutal." He grabbed her chin with fingers that were already extending into claws, forcing her to meet his glowing eyes. "I'm going to tear your precious mate bond apart piece by piece, then rebuild it in my image. And you're going to feel every moment of the process. Like hell you will." The voice that cut through Victor's threats was low, deadly, and utterly familiar. Lyanna's heart leaped as Ragnar stepped through the great hall's massive doorway, his silver eyes blazing with the cold fury of an alpha protecting his mate. Behind him came warriors she recognized, members of his pack who had infiltrated the stronghold during the chaos of the ritual. "Cousin," Victor said, his grip tightening on Lyanna's chin hard enough to leave bruises. "How good of you to join us. Though I'm afraid you're too late to stop what's already begun." "Am I?" Ragnar's smile was all teeth and deadly promise. "Because from where I stand, it looks like your blood witch is nothing but ash. Your ritual circle is destroyed, and my mate just proved she's far more dangerous than either of us gave her credit for." Through their bond, Lyanna felt his fierce pride in her actions, but also his concern for her condition. The magical backlash had weakened her more than she had realized, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could remain conscious. "It doesn't matter," Victor replied, though his voice carried a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. "She's still here, still within my power. One snap of her pretty neck, and your precious mate bond dies with her." "True," Ragnar agreed conversationally, taking another step into the hall. "But you seem to be forgetting something important about bonds between powerful alphas and awakened moon-blessed healers." "Which is?" Before Victor could react, Lyanna felt power flowing through the mate bond. Not her energy going to Ragnar, but his strength filling the hollow spaces in her spirit. The connection between them, tested by separation and magical interference, suddenly blazed with renewed vitality. "They work both ways," Ragnar said calmly. Victor's eyes widened in horror as he realized what was happening. But it was too late. Lyanna's moon-blessed abilities, amplified by Ragnar's alpha power, erupted from her in a wave of pure, cleansing energy. Victor screamed as the power burned through him, not enough to kill, but more than sufficient to send him crashing to the floor in agony, his grip on her finally broken. The guards who had been moving to surround Ragnar suddenly found themselves facing his elite warriors, and the great hall erupted into chaos as silver flashed in the torchlight and the sounds of battle rang from the ancient stones. But Lyanna only had eyes for Ragnar as he covered the distance between them in 3 swift strides, gathering her into his arms with desperate relief. "My brave, brilliant mate," he murmured against her hair, and she could feel his hands shaking as they held her. "What you did to that witch. I felt your courage through our bond. I've never been more proud of anyone in my life." "Is it over?" she asked, though she could still hear fighting echoing from other parts of the stronghold. "Not yet," Ragnar replied grimly, his eyes finding Victor's writhing form across the hall. "But soon. Victor's supporters are scattered, his alliance with dark magic is broken, and word of his treachery has spread to every pack within 100 miles. He has nowhere left to run." Victor struggled to his knees, his face twisted with pain and fury that would have been frightening if not for the obvious defeat written in every line of his body. "This isn't finished, cousin. Even if you kill me, there will be others. Others who understand that power belongs to those strong enough to take it. Perhaps," Ragnar said quietly. "But they'll find something they're not prepared for waiting. a united front, and the knowledge that true strength doesn't come from domination or fear, but from protecting those we love. As the sounds of battle began to fade, and Victor's remaining supporters either surrendered or fled, Leanna felt hope blooming in her chest like sunlight after the longest winter. The nightmare was finally ending, and through their bond, she could sense new possibilities unfurling. A future where her abilities could be used to heal rather than destroy, to unite rather than dominate. They were free, both of them. Finally, and completely free. Chapter 8. The Crown of Luna. 6 months had passed since the night Victor's treachery was exposed, and his dark alliance with blood magic finally broken. 6 months of rebuilding, healing, and forging new alliances between territories that had once viewed each other with suspicion and mistrust. The great hall of Ragnar's stronghold bore no resemblance to the dark, oppressive space it had been under Victor's brief occupation. Now it glowed with warm firelight and echoed with celebration, filled with representatives from dozens of neighboring territories who had come to witness something unprecedented: the formal coronation of a moon-blessed Luna. Leanna stood before the ancient mirror in her chambers, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back at her. The simple healer's dress had been replaced by robes of midnight blue silk, embroidered with silver threads that caught light like captured starlight. Around her throat rested a collar of worked silver, not a mark of submission, but a symbol of power that had belonged to Luna Queens for generations beyond count. Her dark hair had been woven with tiny silver bells that chimed softly with each movement, and her green eyes seemed to glow with inner light that spoke of magic fully awakened and embraced. "You look like the moon goddess herself," Ragnar said from the doorway, his voice filled with the same wonder that had colored their interactions since they had emerged victorious from Victor's stronghold. He was magnificent in his own ceremonial robes, the deep forest green complementing his silver eyes and the carefully groomed beard that had become his signature. "I feel like I'm about to face the most important test of my life," Leanna admitted, turning to face the man who had become her anchor in a world that sometimes still felt overwhelmingly vast. "What if the other packs reject my authority? What if they think a former village healer has no business leading territories?" Ragnar crossed the room in 3 swift strides, taking her hands in his and squeezing gently. Through their mate bond, which had grown stronger and more complex over the past months, she could feel his absolute confidence in her abilities. The same woman who sacrificed her mother's ring to save a condemned stranger, who faced down a blood witch and destroyed centuries of dark magic, who united 3 separate pack territories through nothing but determination, healing magic, and an unshakable moral compass. He smiled, the expression transforming his stern features into something warm and inviting. "That woman is more than ready to be Luna." From the great hall below came the sound of voices raised in harmony, the ancient songs that preceded all major pack ceremonies. Leanna felt familiar nervousness flutter in her stomach, mixed with something deeper and more profound. Today wasn't just about accepting a title or position of power. Today was about fully embracing the destiny that had been calling to her since the night she walked into Blackmoor prison, with nothing but desperate hope and her mother's ring. "There's something else," she said quietly, her free hand moving to rest on the subtle curve that was only just beginning to show beneath her ceremonial robes. "Something wonderful I need to tell you before we go down there." Ragnar went very still, his enhanced senses no doubt detecting the subtle changes in her scent that she had only begun to notice herself a few days ago. Through their bond, she felt his growing excitement and wonder. "Leanna, the pack healers confirmed it this morning," she said, unable to suppress the radiant smile that spread across her face. "Twins, a boy and a girl, if their predictions prove accurate. Our bond was so powerful that it created new life almost immediately after completion." For a heartbeat, Ragnar simply stared at her, his silver eyes wide with shock and growing joy. Then he swept her into his arms, spinning her around the chamber, while his laughter echoed off the stone walls with pure elation. "Twins," he repeated, setting her down gently and cupping her face in his hands. "Moon-blessed twins born to an alpha bloodline. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How miraculous? Rare enough that half the representatives downstairs will probably want to negotiate betrothal contracts before the children can even walk," Leanna replied with mock seriousness. though her heart raced with joy at his reaction. "Let them try," Ragnar growled, his protective instincts already flaring at the mere suggestion. "Our children will choose their own mates when they're ready, just as their parents did. They'll be raised with love, not political maneuvering." The sound of ceremonial horns from below indicated that the coronation was about to begin. Lyanna took a deep breath, drawing strength from their bond and the new life growing within her, and nodded to Ragnar that she was ready. They made their way to the great hall together, their footsteps echoing in perfect synchronization. The assembled crowd fell silent as they appeared at the top of the grand staircase. Hundreds of faces turned upward to witness this historic moment. Lyanna could see pack leaders from territories that had been enemies for generations standing side by side, united in recognition of what she and Ragnar had accomplished together. At the center of the hall stood the ceremonial circle, but instead of the corrupted blood magic Victor had attempted to use, this one was drawn with blessed silver and surrounded by candles that burned with pure white flame. The Elder of Elders, an ancient werewolf whose authority transcended individual pack loyalties, waited beside the circle with the Luna crown in his weathered hands. "Who comes before this assembly to be recognized as Luna?" the Elder called out, his voice carrying easily through the vast space. "I do," Lyanna replied, her voice steady and clear. "Lyanna Ravencrest Ironwolf, mate to Ragnar Ironwolf, alpha of the Stormfang Pack, protector of the United Territories of the Northern Reaches. And what do you offer as proof of your worthiness to bear this ancient responsibility?" This was the moment Lyanna had been preparing for, the question that would determine whether the assembled packs accepted her authority or rejected it. She stepped forward into the ceremonial circle, feeling the blessed silver warm beneath her feet. "I offer the healing of old wounds," she said, extending her hands and allowing her moon-blessed abilities to manifest as golden light that pulsed from her palms. "I offer unity where there was division, protection for the innocent, and the wisdom to know when mercy serves better than vengeance." The light from her hands spread outward, touching each person in the great hall and carrying with it a sense of peace and belonging that transcended pack loyalties. She heard gasps of wonder from the crowd as they felt the touch of ancient magic, the same power that had once blessed the first unions between wolves and humans. "I offer my life, my magic, and my unborn children to the service of all our people," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Let the wolves of every territory know that they have a Luna who will fight for them, heal them, and protect them as fiercely as she protects her own family." The Elder stepped forward, lifting the Luna crown high above his head. It was a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship. Silver wrought into the shape of a crescent moon, set with stones that seemed to hold captured moonlight in their depths. "Then by the authority vested in me by the Council of Ancients, by the blessing of the moon goddess herself, and by the acclamation of the assembled packs, I crown you Lyanna Ironwolf, Luna of the United Territories." As the crown settled onto her head, Lyanna felt a surge of power unlike anything she had experienced before. Not just her own moon-blessed abilities, but the combined strength of every pack that had chosen to accept her authority. Through the mate bond, she felt Ragnar's fierce pride and love, but also something new, absolute certainty that together they could build something lasting and beautiful from the ashes of old conflicts. The great hall erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the stronghold. Pack leaders who had been enemies mere months ago stepped forward to offer their loyalty, their warriors raising voices in songs of celebration that spoke of unity and hope for the future. But as the celebration reached its peak, Lyanna felt a familiar warmth stirring in her chest. Not the mate bond this time, but something deeper and more mysterious. The twins she carried seemed to respond to the magic flowing through the hall, their tiny sparks of life pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She looked at Ragnar and saw the same realization reflected in his silver eyes. Their children would be born into a world of peace and unity, raised with the knowledge that love could triumph over hatred, that courage could overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the greatest sacrifices led to the most beautiful rewards. "Luna," Ragnar said formally, offering her his arm with a smile that was purely for her, despite the hundreds of witnesses surrounding them. "Alpha," she replied, accepting his escort with the same mixture of love and respect that had brought them to this moment. As they walked together through the cheering crowd, Lyanna caught sight of a small table near the back of the hall, where her mother's ring rested in a place of honor. She had never expected to see it again after trading it to free Ragnar from his cell, but it had been recovered and returned to her as a symbol of the sacrifice that had started their incredible journey. The ring gleamed in the candlelight, its ancient runes seeming to pulse with their own inner fire. Her mother would have been proud, Lyanna realized, to see her daughter not just surviving in the world of supernatural politics, but thriving in it. The healing traditions that had been passed down through generations of moon-blessed women would continue through her children, creating a legacy that would endure long after she and Ragnar became nothing but cherished memories. "What are you thinking about?" Ragnar asked quietly as they reached their places at the high table. Lyanna smiled, one hand moving instinctively to rest over the twins growing within her. "The future," she replied. "Our future, our children's future, and all the beautiful possibilities that open up when you're brave enough to sacrifice everything for love." As the celebration continued around them, Alpha and Luna sat side by side, their bond strengthened by trials overcome and their hearts full of hope for the tomorrow they would build together. The woman who had once believed herself ordinary had become the cornerstone of a new age, and the man who had been condemned to die alone had found his true purpose in protecting and cherishing the mate who had saved not just his life, but his very soul. Sometimes, Lyanna reflected as she watched their people celebrate in the great hall that had once echoed with Victor's cruelty, the most beautiful love stories began with the darkest moments, and sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, those stories had the most magnificent endings of all.